Thank you, Andrew. What a great idea it was to put the sociologist at the end of the day, after like the world's funniest and smartest psychologist. And let me tell you, like, I am ready to give you my time so you can come up here and tell jokes, because if that wasn't the funny bit, mostly I want to come off the stage because like I worship improv everywhere. And then there were guys who could fly on a bicycle. So what am I going to do? So this yikes. Okay. This is going to be a talk about failure. It's going to not the come on. It's going to be about my failure to understand how to do mindful sociology, but it's also going to be about how failure can lead to learning. And I have the image of my book on the screen for you in what is surely a failed effort to get you to buy the damn thing. But the truth is it's there for another reason, which is that this book had the hardest won title of anything I've ever done. For many years, I was under contract to write a book called Alone in America. So you're kind of getting the point. It's a really that's a different idea than going solo. And so pay attention to the image here too, because if you think about Alone in America, I'm guessing you already have the image. You know what the cover of that book looks like, and I'm going to show it to you in just a moment. So in the next 18 minutes, I'm going to try to persuade you of two things. And this is the first one. And I'm just going to presume literacy here. So I'm not going to, is that fair? Is that okay? Okay? And this is the other. So if I can do those two things, it's going to be a good cocktail party. All right. If the book is called Alone in America, this is the cover, right? Are you with me on this? The Edward Hopper, Nighthawks, 1943. It's a fascinating painting. Like we look at the guy whose back is to us, and we project onto him this kind of sense of loneliness. It's a sad night for the guy. It's interesting that we don't see his face, right? Because in fact, he could be smiling, having the time of his life, but we see him as kind of a lonely figure. I've always thought the couple in the back is the one that really looks lonely and sad. Like, it is not a love connection for these guys tonight. But this is the kind of great quintessential image of what it feels like to be alone and alienated, isolated in an American city. And it's an iconic piece of work. And to put it in its context, that was fair. Around the time that it was painted, about 22% of American adults were single, and 9% of American households had just one person. This was most common when living alone in the big western sprawling states like Wyoming and Nevada. And it was most common among men, migrant working men, who were generally on their path towards some more connected, married future, probably. And so it's no surprise that when your predecessors, psychologists at the University of Michigan, did a survey of Americans' attitudes towards people who were single and were okay being single, 85% of respondents thought that people who were fine being single were either sick or neurotic or, my favorite, immoral. And I have searched everywhere to find the social science that asks this question today. And you can't even ask the question because people would just laugh at you. What do you think about single people? Maybe we'll talk later. So I'm a sociologist, and this is a talk of, in a day event about innovation. And I thought, well, is there anything more innovative than changing the entire way in which we organize our lives and our households? 22% of American adults were single in 1950. Today, it's just about 50%. 9% of households were one-person households in 1950. Today, it's about 28%. My colleagues get excited when there's like a 2 or 3% change in something, Can you believe that finding? These numbers are crazy. So Alone in America came from this other book I'd written about a heat wave in Chicago when hundreds of people died alone. And I just presumed that the people who had died, who were typically very old and sick and poor and isolated, looked like people who lived alone more generally. I got fascinated when I learned about what had happened to them in this event and got started on this Alone in America book. The first thing I did when I decided to write about the bigger topic was to look at the general profile of people who are living alone. And if you look at the bottom bar chart here, that's where the really interesting information is. There are about 33 million Americans who are living alone today. 11 million of them are over 65. That's a lot of people. But what you can see here is the great majority of people who live alone are younger than that. The biggest demographic slice is middle-aged adults between the ages of 35 and 64. And in recent decades, the fastest growing group of Americans living alone has been young adults under the age of 35. And that's true despite the recession that we've had. Really significant. We now get married later than ever before in recorded history. And for many adults, because we marry in our late 20s or 30s or 40s, if at all, it's actually getting a place of your own that's the way you become an adult. Right? It means you're not living with your parents in your basement. You're not living with friends anymore. It's a really significant shift. And at the top, you can just see the rise in the proportion of households. That's the data I showed you before. I told you that in the 1950s, people who lived alone tended to live in these big Western states. Now it's an urban phenomenon, right? And you might not be surprised to see in the bottom corner that in Manhattan, where I live, it's about 1 of every 2 households. That's a one-person household. But look at these cities where living alone is 40+% of all households. You know, Cleveland, Atlanta, Seattle, Denver, Minneapolis. Those are not the kinds of places that you would predict. This is a big change. There's a booming conversation in the social sciences about what's wrong with us, why we've grown so disconnected. The best-selling sociology books of all time have titles like The Lonely Crowd, The Fall of Public Man. And you probably all heard about Bowling Alone or Sherry Turkle's book Alone Together. And the notion here has always been that once upon a time there was this golden age and our relationships were stronger and our families were better connected and we knew our neighbors and we didn't feel lonely. And basically since then, everything has gone to hell, right? That's a story we tell. But when I look at those numbers at the places where people are living alone and notice the affluence of so many of those cities in this country, I thought, couldn't we spin the story a little bit differently? What if we asked this question instead? I did more than 300 interviews with people who live alone. I hired a team of researchers. We went out across the country and outside of the country to some extent as well. And the themes that came out of those interviews were very clear. People are paying a premium to get places of their own these days and choosing it over other available options because it gives them freedom to do the things that they want to do. It gives them some degree of control over their personal lives, often in times when they don't have much of that control. That's especially true for people who've just gotten out of a relationship or a marriage. It gives people a chance to figure out who they are. Young people generally said that before I can commit to a relationship with another person, I really need to understand who I am and what I want and what I'm seeking in a partner, right? So if this was the PopTech in the 1970s, we'd call that self-realization. Strangely, living alone gave people both the experience of solitude, which can be hard to come by in an age where we're bombarded with media, and also the capacity to reconnect, because when we have that solitude, right, like Thoreau in the woods, the point wasn't just to get away, it's also to make a stronger return on terms that we like. Now, from a bigger perspective, sociologically, you can't understand the rise of living alone without understanding affluence. It is virtually impossible to go solo if you live in a poor nation or a poor neighborhood. So you need some degree of affluence, whether that comes from the welfare state or from the market. But that's not enough to explain it, because there's lots of things that we can afford to do that we don't do. So there's something more to the story. I always know how old the crowd is by whether or not they laugh at the image of Mary Tyler Moore. I heard a couple chuckles out there. You can't understand the rise of living alone outside of the rising status of women. When women enter into the paid labor force en masse, when women gain control of their own bodies and their own lives, the world changes. The age of first marriage goes up, the divorce rate goes up, and the rate of people living on their own soars. This is a key part of the story here, and I know it's key because I can tell you about several nations on Earth where there's high levels of affluence and basically no one lives alone. And there are places like Saudi Arabia, right, where you just don't have the same independence for women to make that decision. You also can't understand the rise of living alone outside of the communications revolution. First with the telephone and the radio, which make the experience of being home and alone a more connected one because you can get a lot of information from the outside coming to you and even have some conversations on a telephone. Now think about what it is to be home and alone when you have the internet, and with it, texting and instant messaging and Facebook and email and Skype and Meetup. You can be home and alone and also connected to the world in all kinds of interesting ways. Now, like you, I understand the problems of a world where we're connected too much of the time, and let me just say that when the guy before put on the slide of a third or 80% of millennials who sleep with their phone, it felt like it hit a little close to home. There are a lot of marriages that don't work too well because, we cuddle up to our iPhone at night instead of the person lying next to us. And I don't want to be with a taxi driver barreling down Madison Avenue while, texting and watching a game on TV. These are real problems, and I worry about my young kids being on their machines all the time as well. But what the best research tells us so far is that the people who are the heaviest users of social media are also the heaviest users of FaceTime. No, I don't mean the Apple app of FaceTime, which people generally ask. They actually like interaction and spending time with other people. Communications revolution has made it possible to live alone and be connected. I should tell you something that was incredibly surprising when I did this research. People who live alone are more likely to spend time and socialize with their friends and their neighbors. That we expect. People who live alone are more likely to spend time and money in bars and cafes and restaurants. That we expect. But people who live alone are also more likely to volunteer in civic organizations, which completely blows apart the idea of the selfish single and the narcissist and the world of lonely bowlers that we hear so much about, right? And that's an especially true finding for women. You're not going to believe you when I tell you that there's been some social science research that says that women who are married and in families tend to do more of the domestic labor than men. And I didn't believe it either, and my wife insisted that it was true. Right? And I was like, if you pull that nail out of your head, it's going to go. So that's great social work and important social things to do, but it means also it's much harder to participate in the public sphere. And we know, in contrast, that people who are single have some of that time and use it. You also can't understand the rise of living alone outside of the rise of cities, because when I showed you that map before and you saw Boston or San Francisco or LA or New York or Chicago, and you saw the numbers of living alone, you probably also realized that people who go solo aren't evenly distributed in the city, which means that there are some neighborhoods in every one of those places that's got 50 or 60 or 70% of the households are one-person households. And I bet you know the names of those cities. And I bet furthermore that when you visit those cities, those are the neighborhoods where you want to spend time. That's not just because you're looking for single people, but because those are the fun places, right? Those are the places where there's a booming public life. Because people who live alone don't want to be alone. And that's another thing that we too often mistake. We conflate living alone with being alone or with feeling lonely. They are different things. On average, people who live alone turn the city into their living rooms, right? And they use the city in that way. We talk so often about how cities have revitalized and why they've revived, and we think it's about the supply side of the story, like we build nicer public spaces. We've got Starbucks now. That's some of the story, but there's a demand side of this too, which is that when you live in a city that's packed with people who are single and interested in social life because we are, they bring that interest out into the world, and we all benefit from it. Finally, let me get back to where I started. You can't understand the rise of living alone outside of the rise of aging alone. And this is a more difficult story. Interestingly, people who age alone, like younger people who live alone, are more likely to spend time with friends and neighbors than people who are older and married. And if you talk to them about their preferences for how to live, as I did, they'll tell you, yeah, of course they wish they had their spouse around if they outlive their spouse. But given the options they have, they generally have a very strong preference for having a place of their own over moving back in with their children or living with friends or relatives or, God forbid, some kind of institutional home. And that's not what they would have said 100 years ago. It's a really interesting social change. In fact, they will tell you that their sense of dignity and integrity rests on their capacity to maintain their domestic independence. Right? So if we're going to deal with a world in which we are rapidly aging, and millions of people will be aging alone because of the boomer generation, we also have to deal with an emerging housing crisis. We have to find a way to help people who are living alone and aging alone stay connected so that they don't get dangerously isolated and lonely, which can happen. You can't talk about living alone without dealing with the question of loneliness. It is true that it can be lonely. It can feel lonely to have a place of your own and to not be able to make those connections. You have to project yourself out into the world if you're going solo, and we're not naturally skilled at doing it. We tend not to grow up in a place of our own as children, so we don't have good role models. We don't have a sense of how to make it work, and there's a real learning experience that people go through when they get a place of their own for the first time, whether it's when they're a young person or after a relationship that's broken up or after losing a spouse. And it can be very tough. Loneliness can get dangerous if it leads into a spiral where it brings you towards depression, and the depression brings you to withdrawal, which leads to isolation and back to loneliness. And I'm concerned about that. I don't want to be glib. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of talk about loneliness these days that's hyped, exaggerated. I got into an argument with the guy who wrote this cover story for the Atlantic Monthly, which basically asked the question, is Facebook making us lonely? And answered within the first few paragraphs, yes, in fact, we are lonelier now than we've ever been, which is a great idea, suffering only from the fact that there's not a shred of evidence in the world that this is true. It has a sister finding in the world of the social sciences. About 8 years ago, the major journal in sociology published a report that said 1 in 4 Americans have no social contact, no social intimate, no confidant, no one, not a single person they can talk about difficult matters with. And it's an amazing finding. When the authors published it, they appeared on the cover of USA Today, on every talk show in the country. There were hour-long conversations on NPR about it. Only problem is, 8 years later, we've discovered that the data were wrong. And when we discovered it, guess what story wasn't on the front page of the USA Today? Of the many, many, many interviews I did, perhaps the most powerful theme that came through is that as lonely as it can be to live on your own, there's nothing lonelier than being married to the wrong person. There's nothing lonelier than living with the wrong person, than lying in bed at night and feeling estranged from your own home. And no doubt this is a reason why people are looking for some other thing to do. By the way, I'm a married guy, 2 young children. The point of this talk is not for you to say, honey, I had the best time in Camden. I heard the most interesting things. I think it's time for you to go. That is not the message here. I am a social scientist. I'm here to help us understand. I am not moralizing. But let me just end by moralizing about how much we can learn from recognizing that we're wrong. Remember I told you the title of that book, remember that Alone in America book? It would have been a big seller, I'm telling you. And I screwed up the alone part, you know that now, but what I really screwed up even more was the in America part. This is not a story of self-reliance gone amok. This is not a story of the Lone Ranger who's taken over the country and the perverse values of an America that's falling apart, because we are in fact laggards, not leaders, when it comes to living alone. It's far more common in the Scandinavian countries and in most of Europe. In fact, it's far more common in most of the affluent places on earth that have welfare states and that have booming cities and public life that do the things that we hope our city and our nation does. So let me end by telling you that although I started out to write a book about how estranged we had become from one another, how isolated and sad and lonely the modern world is, what I learned in the end is that it's our interdependence that makes our independence possible. It's in fact because we can connect with each other and provide each other with the kind of resources and support that had always been impossible that we've started to experiment with this new way of living. I'm not telling you it's a good thing or that it's a bad thing. It generates problems and also opportunities. But it's an incredible change. So I hope at this point I've persuaded you that it's a big one, and hopefully change your mind about it as well. Thank you very much.